Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for being with us. Bans on non-citizen voting at the state level have become more frequent since 2018, and this year, we've got a record number of ballot measures related to the issue. 8 state legislatures referred constitutional amendments to the ballot to prohibit state and local governments from allowing non-citizen voting. That's in Idaho, Iowa, Kentucky, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Wisconsin. Back in 1996, Congress passed legislation making non-citizen voting in federal elections a crime. So it doesn't matter which state we're talking about here. When it comes to federal elections, there's nowhere in the country where it is currently legal for non-citizens to vote for the president, for their senators and House members, or really for any federal office. But how common is it exactly for non-citizens to vote in local elections? Have they been allowed to do so at any other point in American history? And what's the broader context for where these ballot measures are coming from? We're here to break it down for you today on this episode of On the Ballot. I'll be joined in the second half of our show by Ryan Byrne, a member of our ballot measures team here at BP, to run through the state measures across the country. But first, I'm joined by Matt Vassalagambros, a reporter for State Line, who covers state-level issues, including voting rights. Matt, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So again, Matt, as I mentioned in our introduction, non-citizen voting is illegal in federal elections and has been for nearly 30 years. But it is actually allowed in a few specific states, which I didn't really know a ton about until I started reading your reporting. So that's why I was so excited in part to talk to you. Can you explain why that is for our listeners?
Yeah, you wouldn't realize that from the national rhetoric that we get. We hear from Republican lawmakers that non-citizen voting is pretty widespread. It's an issue that we should really be concerned about. But the reality is that non-citizens can vote, but only in about 17 localities throughout the country. And in those localities, which include San Francisco, Washington, D.C., a handful of cities and towns in Vermont and elsewhere, really what we're talking about are local elections, school board races, city council races, and really what local leaders wanted when they introduced laws or municipal measures to allow these folks to vote is saying, you have kids in the community, we want you to be able to have a voice, we want you to be able to vote on these measures that you're taxed on, that your kids' education might depend on. And so there are availability for non-citizens to vote, but explicitly they cannot vote in state elections and they cannot vote in federal elections. What a lot of academics who study this have found is that while they can vote in these 17 municipalities throughout the country, not a lot of them are taking advantage of it. And it is really a handful, dozens of people who are voting in these elections, and primarily for 2 reasons. Academics have found for 2 reasons. One is that a lot of folks don't realize they have the right to vote, that the education is just not out there. But what also they found is that folks are nervous about voting. They think that they would get them on a list, they would get ICE's attention. So while there are these 17 localities that do allow people to vote, it's rarely used and it's extremely isolated.
And if I understand correctly, again, from your reporting, it has been allowed at various times in American history. Isn't that right? At least until I think about the 1920s or so.
Yeah, for the first 150 years of our nation's existence, about 40 states at one time or another allowed non-citizens to vote in elections. It was commonplace. It was not controversial. And really what happened was at the turn of the 20th century, there was a severe uptick in anti-immigrant sentiment. You saw a lot of new laws enacted through Congress that targeted certain racial groups, preventing those immigrants from coming in. That's when states started repealing those laws, changing their state constitutions, and making sure that non-citizens could not participate.
And there's about 100 years between, 1920 and now. Did we see non-citizen voting come back a little bit later in the century?
Yeah, it's been mostly these isolated, lesser use things, like I said, in Maryland, Vermont, San Francisco, but this is really in the last 20, 30 years, while advocacy for immigrant groups has kind of increased and become more mainstream, thinking about tangential issues like whether folks who are non-citizens should be allowed to get in-state tuition at colleges or, other sorts of things that try to make sure that they are more part of our society. I think the idea is to integrate folks into society, and one of the ways they can do that is through participating in local elections.
We're going to get into the specifics of the 8 measures voters will be weighing in on later in the show, but I'm curious if you could explain for our listeners what the supposed endgame is here when it comes to banning non-citizen voting via ballot measures. I know you touched on that a little bit, but try to unpack it a little bit more if you can.
Right. I mean, I'll unpack it in two ways. One, I'll say what the public rhetoric is on this, and then maybe what the private desires are for folks who want to pass these measures. I mean, in the first, they say that, folks who want to pass measures that would make it illegal for non-citizens to vote, they say it's just common sense. You get citizenship in a country so that you can participate in their democracy, you can participate in their elections. You are a taxpayer, so you should be able to decide. You bought in, you swore an oath. My dad is an immigrant, and so he remembers very fondly when he took his oath to become a U.S. citizen, and he knew the gravity of that. So that is, as part of what they're saying, it is a privilege to vote as a citizen. And then when you kind of introduce former President Trump into the mix, then they say, well, we need to do this as a safety precaution because the Biden administration has an open border policy and a flood of migrants are coming into this country, and that Democrats are wanting to allow non-citizens to participate in the election so that it will tip the balance toward Democrats. Obviously, there's zero evidence that this is occurring, but that's the rhetoric. And it all kind of stems back to 2016 when President Trump won the Electoral College, but he did not win the popular vote to Secretary Hillary Clinton. And so he's always been sore about the fact that he lost the popular vote. Obviously, we know what happened in 2020 when he lost the election generally. And the former president has been talking about widespread voter fraud again without any evidence. And that the reason why there is so much voter fraud, the reason why he lost these elections is because of a large amount of voter fraud, and that the voter fraud is rooted in non-citizens being able to vote. And so really, a lot of folks say what I just said out loud, and that's their primary motivation. But the common thread that we generally hear is it's common sense. People should vote if they're citizens.
That is essentially the argument for these measures. What's the argument against them?
Well, the first argument is that this is not an issue. It's a non-existent issue. So let's just take a couple of examples here. One is state officials looking into it. Secretaries of state, top election officials in states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Georgia have looked into this issue. They did an audit of their elections. They looked at all the numbers. They tried to see if any non-citizens were actually voting in the election. What they found was maybe a handful, maybe a couple dozen in North Carolina over like a 20-year period. Really nothing that would change any sort of local race, let alone a state race. So, you look at state data, and then you look at a place like the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is one of the leading conservative organizations in the country. I mean, these are not liberal hacks here, okay? And they have a database that look into voter fraud. They look at non-citizen voting. And since 2002, they have found fewer than 100 cases of voter fraud stemming from non-citizens voting. So primarily, the first reason against these things is the numbers. It's just not happening. The second one, and you hear this a lot from voting rights groups, Democratic lawmakers and activists, is that this is rooted in pretty dangerous anti-immigrant rhetoric. Folks can get hurt if you push this too much. We're seeing this a little bit with the Springfield, Ohio case where J.D. Vance and Trump have said that, all these illegal immigrants, these Haitians are hurting a community. There's been bomb threats to local schools. It's getting kind of ugly. And so one of the cons is that this is a non-issue, and what you're trying to do is get people's fears up over a non-issue. There's this boogeyman of non-citizens voting, and there can be some real consequences. And really, I would say that progressives, liberals, Democratic lawmakers would say it's just cheap politics, and it's just trying to get people's heart race up. And so when you look at ballot measures or whatever, and I'm sure you're going to ask about it, they are probably going to pass just because people would be like, of course I don't want a non-citizen to vote. But if you really look at the data, you could see that there's ulterior motives in the motivation.
And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the second half of the show, but you're right saying that they're probably going to pass. We've seen, I believe, 6 similar ballot measures since 2018, and all those have passed so far. So pretty good chance that these will pass as well. But I'm wondering, you just unpacked a bunch for us from both sides of the argument, but what else are you hearing on the ground when you're reporting? What are you learning from both voters and elected officials that you might not have mentioned just now?
Well, I would say that this rhetoric about widespread voter fraud, non-citizens participating, that kind of misleading lies. I mean, if we're being completely truthful here, it is a lie. It has had an impact on the way that people view the elections and view election integrity. I don't think the American people were necessarily prepared to have their president, the leader of their party, lie on on a regular basis. And, that's not me being partisan. That's just me telling the truth here. And so people have, especially obviously Republicans, believe that there is widespread voter fraud in American politics. And that's just not the case. But what's happened is that if you look at the polls, for a long time, the polls have said 70% of Republicans think that the 2020 election was stolen, that there is this widespread voter fraud. Usually the majority of Americans have still maintained that, they believe in democracy. But even this week, I saw a new poll from NPR and Marist that showed that 6 in 10 Americans believe that there is widespread voter fraud, and they're concerned about the integrity of our elections. And so that rhetoric from the very top of politics, from Donald Trump and his allies, it does filter down. It does get into people's heads. And they start thinking that there is widespread voter fraud. And so when I'm on the ground, I was just on a trip in Michigan and Wisconsin. I've been to Georgia this year, Arizona. And when I'm on the ground, a lot of people do believe this, and it is not as if they're malicious people themselves. They really do care about the country. They care about democracy. And they're hearing the leader of their party tell them that there's this problem, and they believe him. And so what I see on the ground is that people take that to heart, and then it leads to other consequences. It leads to an increase in threats. Most of my job is speaking to local election officials in counties and cities. They're getting death threats, racist harassment. They've had to add new security measures, locks, panic doors, go through mass shooting drills. And, this is not the way that a functional, healthy democracy should work. And that dangerous rhetoric does have consequences, and we're seeing it on the ground.
So you brought up Trump a couple of times there, Matt, and I'm wondering, with the White House in mind, depending on who wins the election, whether or not we might actually see something at the federal level. The federal government in 1996 made this illegal for non-citizens to vote for the president, for the House or the Senate, any number of federal elections. Could they do the same thing at the federal level when it applies to local elections? Could we see something like that?
Yeah, they've already tried almost. The congressional Republicans tried this year to enact a measure that would ban non-citizens from voting. It was blocked by congressional Democrats. Obviously, this was an attempt by Republicans to try to pin the issue on Democrats and say, see, they're allowing, like we said, they're allowing migrants to flood in the country so that they could sway elections. And then, like I said, also rooted in voter fraud. And if Trump loses, they have someone to blame. If Donald Trump does become president again and Republicans control the Congress, absolutely, I think we'd see it. I think we'd see several different measures. And it would be kind of paradigm shifting, because there's always been an assumption in this country that U.S. elections are highly decentralized. There are 10,000 election offices in this country. It's run at the county level, your cities, your towns, the state. And the federal government really doesn't have a lot of power generally in elections. Obviously, Voting Rights Act and the Help America Vote Act are other examples of federal action in elections. But, with the way that the former president has spoken about elections, I do think that we would see a more heavy hand in it. I think that concerns a lot of people, a lot of election experts, a lot of voting rights groups, not just Democrats, who would be concerned that it would be some sort of power move on Donald Trump's part. And so, to answer your question, yes, I think we would see it. I think it would be one of many measures that we would see that would restrict access.
Well, Matt Vasilogambros, thank you again for your time. We really appreciate your insights, and we'll definitely have to have you back on the show sometime in the new year after the election season.
Thank you very much. It was great to be here.
Yeah, and our listeners, please stay tuned. We'll be right back with Ballot Measures staff writer Ryan Byrne. We're going to take a closer look at the record 8 measures we're seeing across the country this year trying to ban non-citizen voting at the state and local level. This is On the Ballot. Thanks again for listening. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Hi there. I'm Hannah Nelson, the External Relations Manager at Ballotpedia. We're excited to kick off our Ballotpedia Society membership campaign to grow our incredible community of monthly donors who make our work possible. Ballotpedia Society members are crucial in helping us expand our tools and resources to provide voters with accurate and reliable information to make informed decisions at the ballot box. This monthly support is vital as we deliver neutral, easy-to-understand content to millions of Americans. As a BPS member, you'll enjoy exclusive updates and insider access to insights from our expert team. Ready to join? Head over to donate.ballotpedia.org/ontheballot2024. Again, that website is donate.ballotpedia.org/ontheballot2024 to make your donation today. Thank you for being such an important part of our mission. We couldn't do it without you.
Ryan, thanks for coming back on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Can you break down the buildup of these kinds of ballot measures over the last couple of years?
Yeah, for sure. So we didn't really start seeing them until 2018. The first one was in North Dakota, and that amendment was actually citizen initiated, which means people collected signatures to put it on the ballot. That's different from this year's amendments. All of them were put on the ballot by state legislatures. So going back to North Dakota, the first ballot initiative was led by a state senator with financial backing from an organization called the Liberty Initiative Fund. And then post-2018, we saw two more initiatives, Florida and Colorado. Both of those were supported by another nonprofit called Citizen Voters, Inc. The founder of that organization was actually also an advisor for America First policies, which supported President Trump. We also saw the Alabama state legislature refer an amendment to the ballot. Then post-2020, these are actually coming from legislatures rather than citizen-initiated petitions. 2020, we saw them in Louisiana and Ohio. Now this year, as you noted, we're seeing them in 8 more states.
Got it. And thinking back over the last couple of years, how successful have these ballot measures been?
Yeah, so they've all been approved. The lowest approval was in Colorado, and even there it still got 63%, and the highest was in Florida with 78%. So between the 6 measures that have been approved so far, the average was about 73. While there is plenty of commentary kind of critiquing these amendments, we've seen very little campaign spending to actually oppose them. So there hasn't really been organized opposition against these amendments.
Most of these ballot measures are aiming to amend state constitutions. What's the rationale for that strategy?
Yeah, that's a good question. As is the case with ballot measures, it depends on who you ask with any policy, but there's something that both sides do agree on, and it's that these constitutional amendments would prohibit local governments from allowing non-citizens to vote in local elections. As you noted at the beginning, there are some jurisdictions across the country that do allow non-citizens to vote. For example, San Francisco allows non-citizens to vote in school board elections. So the logic is kind of preemptive. While in the states that are voting on it this year, local governments don't currently allow non-citizens to vote, these amendments would essentially prevent that from ever happening in the future. So, right, they're voting on it in Wisconsin. You could have a city like Madison, Wisconsin, right? Madison may want to authorize non-citizen immigrants to vote in school board elections like San Francisco. But if this amendment is passed, local governments want to have that ability. And then there's kind of a second argument about the logic of these ballot measures, mainly coming from the opposition, which says that these amendments are kind of symbolic or cultural, and they're kind of attempts to push a narrative that non-citizen voting is happening in large numbers. So the fact that the amendments are on the ballot kind of brings attention to that storyline.
We've got tons of details about these ballot measures linked in our show notes for listeners. But Ryan, while I was looking through them, I noticed that 6 of the 8, if I have it right, are pretty similarly titled, something to the effect of citizenship requirement for voting amendment or something like that. Were these measures developed together across state lines by any chance, like maybe an advocacy group or something like that? Or if they weren't, what do they have in common?
That's a good question. So there are advocacy groups. I don't know to what extent they are kind of actively lobbying across these states. I mentioned Citizen Voters, Inc. earlier. There's also another one that seems to be more active this year called Americans for Citizen Voting. And Americans for Citizen Voting does on their website, have a list of states that they're kind of targeting for more amendments in the future, so they could be involved. Now, it's also not uncommon for ballot measures to kind of snowball. So one state passes something, like North Dakota in 2018. Legislators in another state decide, hey, that passed by a good margin. We kind of like the idea. Then more and more. I think that's part of the effect as well. So it's a little unclear to what extent there's a whole lot of lobbying efforts here versus just kind of the policy snowballing over time. It's probably a mix of both. What they have in common is that they're all effectively doing the same thing. In fact, all 8. So 6 of them are very similar. And then there's 2 more that do the same thing, but then also something else. And we can talk a little bit more about those as well. But what they're all doing, despite some variation in wording, is prohibiting local governments or the state from allowing non-citizens to vote.
As you mentioned, there are 2 that are a little bit different. As I was reading through them, the one that I thought was pretty interesting was out of Iowa. Again, like you said, it's getting at the same thing as the others, those other 6, but will also, quote, allow 17-year-olds who will be 18 by the general election to vote in primary elections, which sounds a little confusing to me, but do I have that right? What's the logic there?
Yeah, so no, you have that right. So actually in Iowa, 17-year-olds can already vote in primaries if they're going to turn 18 by the general, but it's statutory. It's not in the Constitution. So the Constitution adds another layer of protection for that policy. Both of them are related to suffrage, not necessarily citizen voting, as you said. So they did put the 2 together. I think if you want to talk about policy objectives being different with amendments, Missouri is probably an even better example to look at. So in Missouri, they're voting on a constitutional amendment that would prohibit non-citizen voting in the future, but would also prohibit ranked choice voting, which is an electoral system that, we've seen lots of ballot measures and discussion about. So by putting those 2 together, voters can't say, well, I don't want to say never to RCV, but I do want to say no to non-citizen voting, and vice versa. So they're packaged together, so it's an all or nothing deal with those 2 policies.
Yeah, and listeners, if you are curious, just a sidebar here, if you are curious about those RCV ballot measures, we actually ran an episode on that on Friday, so be sure to get in your feed and check that out. Ryan, you mentioned that these sorts of ballot measures, or ballot measures in general, can snowball. Can we expect to see more of these types of ballot measures down the road?
Yeah, I suspect we'll see some even, next cycle in 2026. I think they're mostly going to come up in states where non-citizen voting is not authorized anyway, much like the states this year. The group Americans for Citizen Voting, like I said, does have a list of where they're working to get amendments on the ballot. And those include states like, Georgia and Texas, as well as many others. Now, I think it would be interesting. I don't know if they would ever do this, but there's only one state where local governments can allow non-citizen voting and where an initiative could be used to prohibit it. That's California. Do I think that's likely? Probably not for 2026. But if you ever wanted to see a showdown about this issue, that's how we would get to it. An initiative would go on the ballot in California. But again, I think it's more likely that we see it on states where non-citizen voting is not currently authorized, and states that are being targeted by advocacy groups like Georgia and Texas.
Makes sense. Again, Ryan Byrne of our Ballot Measures team, thank you again. Great to have you on the show as always.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about all of the great ballot measures.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's anyone in the world, maybe Victoria, but it's a tight contest between you and Victoria, as in who likes ballot measures more. It's hard to tell.
I'll give it to Victoria. She can hold that mantle for a little bit.
There you go. You heard it here first. Victoria is the queen of ballot measures world, and this is On the Ballot. Our listeners, please, you can learn more about our ballot measures coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back later in this week with more ballot measures coverage. We're actually going to take a look at abortion-related ballot measures, so be sure to check us out for that later this week. Make sure to subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, and thank you for listening.